Hey everyone, it's me, Charahnee. Welcome to another week of storytelling. So without further ado, let's just get started. Unparalleled. There are many old tales that tells how the universe came to be. But to be honest, the story is not about how a world was born, but how it came to an end. The protagonist, Caleb, was an ordinary person who just loved the stars, nothing less. Now, he didn't have a fancy dream or a goal in life. All he ever desired was the time in the world to stargaze. The story begins with a dream, one which many would just assume that because of his love for the stars, he knew the constellations. And when he woke up, it was but the beginning of his grand adventure. That day, Caleb went to his university to meet his professor, Dr. Kai, who was an astrology professor. But what changed Caleb's routine that day was all but a simple divergent. The professor asked Caleb to go and retrieve his favorite novel from the abandoned planetarium. Because of the seclusion, Caleb was quite shocked to know that there was an old planetarium hidden on campus. But it was all the more reason to go and see what kind of place that planetarium was. The walk to the abandoned planetarium wasn't long. It was just odd that students did not know such a place existed so close to campus. When he arrived, the outer view of the planetarium was like any old buildings that has been left untouched for decades. The entrance was dark and moldy. Caleb cautiously made his way down the dark hallway with the help of his phone's flashlight as his only source of vision. He then came across a doorway, and slowly he opens the door to hear it cringe and creak, echoing in that hollow hall. When he peeked inside, he was taken aback. The ceiling had caved in. The bricks from the wall was neatly stacked to the front of the classroom. The seats were old and dusty, as spiders have made this main room its home. The sky was real and not just some hologram. Caleb slowly made his way down the rows of seats and sat at the front, completely engrossed envisioning what it's like to be in this classroom back in the days. As Caleb sat himself down, the seat felt hard and uncomfortable. He was quick to remove whatever was underneath his seat, only to find an old hardcover textbook, not dusted or anything. The book had all but a simple title, Unparalleled. Curious to know the kind of book his professor read, Caleb turned to the first page of the book to see who the author was. It was an alias's name, a name only the author wished to have, with no intention of revealing themselves. Caleb then turned the next page, as it read, I want to tell you a story about a universe called Lunar. It is similar to our Milky Way. The planets and stars in Lunar are identical to ours. The people there too are similarly like us. But what separates them from our world is that they have time on their side. Caleb read these few lines and was quick to notice that the sun had already set and the moon was starting to show. Perhaps it's because it's the summertime and that the moon paid no mind to Caleb. He then looked back down the book, curious to read what comes next. There are planets and stars very much like Earth's, but these stars and planets are not dead. Not entirely. They all have life still growing. And how they continue to live? Well, they are watched by the constellations, and that is where our story begins. Caleb immersed himself into the book, but the more he read, the more his vision began to blur. When he opened his eyes, it was already morning. Caleb noticed that there was a roof over the planetarium. The seats were all cleaned and the walls weren't moldy with spiderwebs. Everything inside the planetarium looked very clean and polished. Half awake and confused, he made his way out of the door of the building to see a world of greeneries, many villages, and people dressed in traditional clothes. There were lands floating above the sky, and the sky had silhouettes of the planets that could be seen with the naked eye. Caleb then turned back to look at the planetarium, and instead of an old run-down building, it became a marvelous building made of marble with golden pillars. Caleb was starstruck. Everything seemed like a dream, but it was far too real for him to call a dream. But before he could rationally think, he was interrupted. Hey, you there, shouted a royal knight, dressed fancier from his other companions. Yes? Asked Caleb, a bit starstruck by their appearances. What's your name, and why did you come out of the time eclipse without the approval of the 12 courts? Asked the royal knight sternly. Who are you? Asked Caleb. I am the royal commander of the royal army of the Ares royal family, Khalidal J. Gilgamesh V. Now you, state your name, said Commander Khalidal angrily as he points his sword at Caleb, who slowly swallowed his saliva. I'm Caleb. I'm a college student, said Caleb bluntly. What is a college student? Questioned Khalidal confusedly. Well, it's someone who wants to further their knowledge, said Caleb. And what is your field of expertise? Asked Khalidal sternly. I study the stars, said Caleb. Then you're a mage? Asked Khalidal. Caleb was surprised by the words he used. Well, I'm more of a student, said Caleb. If you really are a student, then you won't mind going to meet His Majesty, said Khalidal. The soldiers circled around Caleb and bind his hands behind his back as they made their way over to the palace. The palace is far too grand to not notice. If anything, it was rather catchy and wooing to the eye, like as if it was taunting you. Even the inside of the palace was breathtaking, with many empty rooms left untouched. The walls and floors itself was made with the most unobtainable materials that exist. Caleb's first meeting with the unfamiliar world's king was nothing noteworthy. In fact, it was quite expected of a protagonist's attitude when they fall into an unknown land. The king who sat high in his throne looked intimidating yet alluring. In fact, the people that stood in that throne hall was nothing but perfection. But Caleb's satisfaction by their beauty was quickly killed when the young king blatantly criticized Caleb's improperness. Caleb gritted his teeth as he was tired of being looked down by these beautiful, privileged people who acted all high and mighty. Caleb, who was quite the opinionated one, cursed at the king for being insolent, and that the king was nothing special. Caleb's outburst caused the entire room to be quite baffled by his bold words, and a quiet chuckle broke into a loud laughter from the seat near the young king, who has been silenced by the foreigner. A child that looks not older than 8 laughed underneath her covered mouth. The king called her Queen Libra. She was a cheerful girl, dressed in the finest silks. Her smile outshined her jewels, and her carefree attitude brought all but calmness in the room. That boy certainly knows how to entertain someone, laughed Queen Libra happily. You're only 8,000 years old. If you think that is humor, you have a long way to go, said the king crossly. Oh, King Ares, you know I'm only kidding, but I certainly wouldn't mind taking back with me to my home planet that you claim to have distasteful style, said Queen Libra in a stern voice. I was only joking around, said King Ares, who was quick to back down. The young queen then turned her attention at Caleb. Even to her, he looked oddly strange. You have strange eyes. They are the color of amber, said Queen Libra, intrigued by his eye colors. It's hereditary, said Caleb, avoiding eye contact. There's a legend that says when our creators descended down from the unknown, they had amber eyes. That is how we knew who to follow in times of peril, said Queen Libra, recalling old folklore. So you're saying that this boy is one of our creators? Asked King Ares, unimpressed. It only makes sense as why he was able to use the time eclipse, replied Queen Libra. Khalidal, go and summon Wisteria. We must confirm to see if this is true, said King Ares. Commander Khalidal did as he was told and quickly went to summon Wisteria, one of 2 of the most powerful clairvoyant and mage that exists. Not long afterwards, the commander and Wisteria, a woman in her late 40s, entered the throne room. She was yet another beautiful individual with a mysterious origin. Without hesitation, Wisteria made her way over to Caleb. She reached out her hands, asking for Caleb's consent to cooperate, and he did. As they gazed into each other's eyes, she foresaw the future that shook her to disbelief. In her vision, Caleb stood over the bodies of the lifeless, with dark shadowy titans smirking behind. And when Wisteria made eye contact with one of the shadowy figures, it attacked her for having the audacity to foresee a future that was supposed to be a surprise. The shock was so great that whatever force grabbed her pushed Wisteria out of that vision, and the people inside the throne room witnessed Wisteria suddenly being thrown across the room. Caleb was in disbelief. He was frightened to witness such a sight. That young man, he is a seeker, said Wisteria in a broken voice. Everyone turned to look at Caleb in horror, as he himself was unaware of what that meant to them. He is a descendant of the goddess of disaster. He came here to place judgment, said Wisteria, breaking down into tears. Caleb felt sick to his stomach. It was already agonizing to himself that this is only a dream, and now this, a descendant of the goddess of disaster? Now he really wants to wake up. The king had had enough of this, as he yielded his sword and pointed at Caleb, who froze in fear. If he really is a descent, then tell me this. Why are they placing judgment again? The 100-Year War ended millenniums ago. We are different from our ancestors. The Creators promised us salvation as long as peace remains and us 12 constellations rule justicefully. So tell me, what have we done wrong? Asked King Ares angrily. Caleb was at a loss of words. The things the king uttered was news to him. I want to know why myself. I don't even know why I'm here, replied Caleb desperately. You don't know, or you won't say, asked King Ares. Wisteria then came in between them and vouched for Caleb's words, and asked the king to spare Caleb. She believed, although it is the future she foresaw, it is only but a precedent. It doesn't have to end with the world's destruction. Instead, it could be changed by allowing Caleb to learn about their world. Although the king was hesitant, he wanted what was best for the celestial beings and agreed to the conditions. Wisteria took Caleb under her wings. Where things stand, Caleb wasn't exactly sure if he was the person Wisteria claimed he was, and he made his voice known. Wisteria knew of his origins. She saw a glimpse of his life on Earth. She saw the people he loved, the knowledge that world has, and understood his doubts. And so she showed him her world. Caleb learned many things about this new world. This universe is called Lunar. There are 12 constellations that rule the entire universe, and that they are all very different from each other. They keep the universe balanced and at peace, and according to the Keeper of Time, peace has been with the lunar universe for over 200 millenniums. There are many planets and stars that are very much alive and prosperous, but they are a recovering universe. One day, on a morning stroll by himself, and out of nowhere, a subtle cry lured him away from his usual passageway. He ventured inside the deepest, darkest part of the forest and came across an empty land, hollow and dead, quite different from what he had seen. Perhaps because of the lonesome sorrow, but he could understand the devastation that happened here, and unknowingly cried with the forest. King Ares, who often takes a walk around these parts of the woods, witnessed Caleb crying by himself. "Why are you crying?" asked King Ares confusedly. Caleb told King Ares what he felt, and all Ares did was stand there and listen. "If the goddess of disaster saw you crying for a universe that was supposed to die, she may get upset," joked King Ares. And although it was a profound joke, Caleb continued to cry, afraid that this world that he has come to appreciate will really die. If this world is foreseen to perish, then maybe it's punishment. After all, the first time this planet died was not by the hands of the creators, but by the celestial beings themselves, replied King Ares. King Ares then told Caleb about the 100-Year War. Lunar was never as peaceful as it stands today. 200 millennia ago, the celestial beings were as divided as East and West. There was constant differences that ultimately led to war. The ancestors of the Celestials fought for worse than good. They fought for 100 years. The Seekers descended down to this universe to seek truth and redemption. And when they saw the perishing life that fell upon Lunar, they laid judgment on the surviving constellations by sentencing them to eternal darkness. And when the constellations began to lose themselves, they begged for salvation. They begged for the return of their world. The creators agreed to their plea, but only if the constellations responsible for the war become the planets themselves. They agreed, and life was returned. But even after 200 millennia, the universe is still healing. It was a tragic beginning and a sentimental ending. What mattered was that the celestial beings of today learned from their mistake and is set on rebuilding their world. "So that is why this forest has not completely healed," replied Caleb, as he placed his hands on the dry land. "My ancestors made an unforgivable mistake, but we're not like our ancestors. I don't intend to lose this world a second time," replied King Ares. Caleb, who has been deeply touched by the story, bent down to touch the ceiling. As he held it near his heart, the ceiling began to bloom into a small sprout. Wisteria came across Caleb and his majesty together alone in the middle of the dead forest. She approached them, a bit unsettling in her heart to see an odd duo together. "Your Majesty, what are you doing here? If I'm not mistaken, you only partake in strolls late in the evening," replied Wisteria politely. King Aries smiled and let out a sigh. Perhaps it's a good thing that I took my stroll early. If not, I would not have been able to witness such a grand gift, said King Aries happily. Wisteria then saw the sprout in Calem's hands. Calem, I have to speak to His Majesty in private. Can you please go on ahead? Asked Wisteria kindly. Calem nodded his head and left. I thought you told me you never wanted to see that boy, said Wisteria sternly. Perhaps I was wrong about him, replied King Aries pleasantly. You are quite a mind changer, sire, replied Wisteria. It looks like you've been doing a good job showing him the ropes of our world. Should I reward you? Asked King Aries happily. You should not expect good things so fast, Your Majesty, replied Wisteria. I thought you were confident that our world would not be destroyed, said King Aries. Of course, I'm confident. As confident as a person carrying a cursed lucky rabbit's foot, replied Wisteria angrily. Then, let me ask you something. What became the downfall of our universe? Asked King Aries. Wisteria thought back to the vision, flames engulfing the planets, and the silhouette of one person holding tightly onto a lifeless body. Your Majesty, you trust me, right? Asked Wisteria gently. King Aries was startled by her question and then nodded his head. Then heed my words. No matter how much you find Calem amusing, don't get close to him, said Wisteria, and returned to her cottage in the forest. The king was left with a staggering riddle, one he couldn't decipher himself. But their small encounter will soon spark a subtle friendship, whether they knew it or not. As the days passed by, Wisteria began to try to get Calem to come to terms about his powers. Although Calem wasn't ready to face his fate that Wisteria claimed, Wisteria was adamant to prove that his powers are real, and placed Calem and herself in isolation for a month to meditate. First, she cleared his mind of doubt, cleared his conscience of rationality, and filled his thoughts with nothing. Wisteria brought Calem back to the first time when he openly used his abilities unknowingly. They stood in a rice field with a single apple tree that stood in the center of the field. Calem recognized this place. It was his family's farm. And behind them, Calem saw his younger self, running in the field with celestial animals chasing after him merrily. In disbelief, Calem still has a sweet nostalgia of that vivid feeling, but that memory quickly shifted into reality. It was the night he knew how his parents really felt about him. It was the most heartbreaking thing for Calem to recall. That child can create things from the tip of his fingers. And have you seen his nightmares? Last month, his nightmares manifested and destroyed the house. I'm afraid that one day he may kill us with that power of his, cried Calem's mother, who has had enough of this. Calem stood in the hallway outside the living room, listening into his parents' and grandparents' conversations. His parents did not try to cover up their words. Instead, they looked the other way. The environment changed once again. This particular day was the day Calem went to live with his grandparents. His parents didn't even say goodbye or I love you. They looked at him differently than they used to. The only one who hasn't changed was his older sister, Alina. She was his only son that he desperately tried to hold on to after he left the house. Calem and Wisteria followed his grandparents back to their home, where young Calem played by himself outside. His grandma came to his side and showed him a red string. Calem, do you want Grandma to help you forget about all the painful things? Asked Grandma gently. Grandma, what am I? Asked young Calem sadly. Why, you are you, silly, smiled Grandma happily. Young Calem smiled and slowly put his hand out to let his grandma tie the red string around his wrist. But before that could happen, Calem intervened and grabbed a hold of his grandma's wrist, causing his younger self to disappear, and everything becoming blank. Calem's grandma then turned her head to look at Calem. So, you're finally here, replied Grandma proudly. You can see me? Asked Calem confusedly. Of course. I have the same powers as you. No matter what universe we are in, we can still see each other, even through time and space, replied Grandma happily. His grandmother then led Calem to a different place. They soon reached a night sky with a huge tree covered in bright rainbow colors. This place is my sanctuary. It's a little piece of home, replied Grandma happily. Grandma, where was your home? Asked Caleb curiously. Caleb's grandma told him the world she lived in. The universe was called the solar universe. His grandma's home planet was called Calicia. Calicia was a beautiful planet with many planets and stars. The grass was greener than Earth's, the leaves of the trees were colored in different shades, and the beings were all loving. But that profound love did not last long. A mage became obsessed with the power to control constellations, that the mage created their own army, and evil rose and destroyed the universe. Caleb's grandma was only a teen then, fighting to save her planet. His grandma partaked in imprisoning the evil celestial beings. It was a success, but with many sacrifices. Caleb's grandma, along with her fellow users, used all their 9 planets as a cocoon to imprison the evil celestials to avoid catastrophe to other universes. When it all ended, as the last survivor of her universe, Caleb's grandma unconsciously used the last ounce of her power to teleport away from her world, where she found Earth and met Caleb's grandpa and fell in love. "Do you miss home?" asked Caleb. "Every day. So, come home safe and sound, my love, and tell me the adventures you had," smiled Grandma. Caleb opened his eyes to see himself return back to reality. Caleb continued to isolate himself with Asteria deep in the willow forest, and continues to learn every kind of knowledge he could learn from about this new world. He begins to love this new world, and helped its rebirth. He helped them rebuild their homes, and evidently time passed by. Nearly 2 years have passed since Caleb's arrival. Nonetheless, Caleb has completely fallen in love with the lunar universe, as well as the individuals there. But as things begin to look bright for the future lunar universe, an unprecedented being appeared. The mysterious traveler crash-landed into the universe. She called herself Asteria, a seeker from the solar universe. She had been trapped in the solar universe for millenniums after trapping evil. The entire lunar universe was in complete disbelief. They have never heard of a universe, but Asteria's story was quite persuasive. She warned the 12 courts about the end of the lunar universe, pointing her fingers right at Caleb. She then spoke. "He may be a seeker, but his heart still has doubts, and because of that doubt, it would surely tempt evil to manipulate him," replied Asteria. Although her warning was swept under the carpet by the 12 courts, Caleb's heart was not content. Asteria was taken in by the Temple of Mages, while many unprecedented rumors began to spread throughout the universe about the prophecy that Asteria cried. It caused many celestial beings to be afraid of Caleb. His heart was heavy with the prophesied event, and then, one evening, on a full moon, a wandering scholar knocked on Caleb's door and asked him for some food and water. The mysterious scholar thanked Caleb for his kindness, and in exchange, he gave Caleb an old book that is said to have divine powers to ward off evil. With the instructions handed to Caleb, he chanted the ancient words of spells. Instead of a protection spell, Caleb had chanted a spell to reverse the universe back to its original state millenniums ago. The 12 ancestors of the constellation rose up from the planet they embody and started to destroy the universe. Enraged and disappointed by his beloved friend, King Ares sent Caleb back to his world. Before Caleb realized it, he was back in the abandoned planetarium. Filled with frustration and guilt, Caleb tried to force his way back to the lunar universe, but no matter how much he wished to return, he could not. Caleb sat himself down, exhausted and desperate. He cried for some kind of sign until the doors to the abandoned planetarium opened up. Caleb turned to see Professor Kai, standing there with a smile on his face. "You returned so soon. It's only been 3 months," replied Professor Kai. The professor told Caleb his true identity. He was Kalito, only he's aged a bit. According to Kalito, he was the last survivor of his universe. He lived in Caleb's universe for 60 years. How he got here was because in the future, Caleb sent Kalito to the past in hopes that this time around, Caleb will not make the same mistake. But not a thing changed. Kalito then gave Caleb an hourglass. Kalito told Caleb that even if a future that one doesn't want happens, there's still time to fix it. Caleb quickly returned to the lunar universe. When he arrived, he stood above the destroyed time eclipse, among a burning planet, and high in the sky, he could clearly see the planets that were restored no longer had its colors. Cries of the innocent echoed through the chaos, and nothing could be done about it. Caleb slowly walked through the darkness engulfed by flames as celestials ran from death, and he came upon Ares, lying completely still and unattached to the sounds around him. On top of Ares' lifeless body sat Asteria, dressed in her best and with a grin. Enraged by her cruelty, Caleb screamed at her, but she did not yield. Instead, she provoked him, egging him to lose his cool. Why should you allow these beings to live? They only love you when you use your powers for good. And yet, when you made a futile mistake, they outcasted you, like you're some kind of monster. Isn't that what you hate the most? Those who aren't genuine, questioned Asteria. Get off him, shouted Caleb angrily. Asteria could only wonder what is going on in that mind of his. I'll get off of him after you handle them, replied Asteria. Caleb turned around to face the former ancestors of the constellations. Caleb thought that it was best to get through to them by showing them their world before they lost sight of their purpose. Caleb showed them the things he had learned after living in the lunar universe for 2 years. The ancestors watched for a long time, admiring the world's beauty, and when they calmed their anger, their eyes fell onto Asteria, who knew she had lost her control over them. They created a black hole and dragged her with them into the black hole, disappearing forever. Caleb then used the last of his powers to revive everyone and everything. Although peace and prosperity once again dawned on that universe, Caleb had a tough decision ahead of him. Will you stay here with me? Asked Ares. Caleb was startled. He then looked down at the hourglass and thought about his grandparents in Toledo. I want to go home, replied Caleb, who has become homesick. Ares then smiled and hugged Caleb. I wish you gave time on your choice, but if it's home, then that's fine. After all, you'll come back, replied Ares happily. Caleb smiled and nodded his head. He returned to the newly built time eclipse as the 12 constellations watched him stand there. Caleb tried to use his power to return home, but nothing worked. That was when Wisteria told Caleb the truth about his purpose. Since he had made his choice of saving this universe, the resurrection of life came with limitations, unfortunately, and it seems that he won't be able to come back if he chooses to leave. Go home. You have many tales to tell, replied Ares. Caleb gave his friends all one last hug before breaking the hourglass that would take him back to his world. When he returned back to Earth, he stood outside the abandoned planetarium, with Toledo reading his favorite book. I could have sworn you were going to stay there, replied Toledo confusedly. Caleb chuckled. He did want to stay, but he also missed home. I haven't lost hope yet, even if today I can't travel to the lunar universe. Maybe tomorrow I can, replied Caleb proudly. And so, 6 years passed. Caleb had written a memoir about the lunar universe, and every day he would read that memoir at the abandoned planetarium to his heart's content, closing his eyes and recalling the feeling, the sound, the smile, and the people he loved. That morning was no different. Caleb sat in the planetarium, his book in front of him. As he began to read, his eyes became sleepy, and when he rested his eyes just for a second, he was lightly wakened up by a familiar scent of magnolias. Hey, sleepyhead. What took you so long? Replied Ares with a bright smile. Caleb was starstruck, but he would no longer question why he is there. Instead, he was glad to see this unparalleled universe. Alright everybody, so that is it for my third short story called Unparalleled. I hope that y'all enjoyed it, and I'll see y'all next week for another story. I know that I have been writing kind of sad stories so far, but I promise you I will try to find more ways to have happier endings and things like that. But I will have to warn you that my next story that it's gonna be released next week is kind of a very sad love story, so I really apologize ahead of time. Let's get the sad stories done with first, and then we'll get on with the love stories, okay? I promise I will get this love stories going. Alright, thank you so much, and I hope y'all have a great day. Bye!